To some extent, as I see it, what science used to be, it's similar, in my mind, to philosophy. It's the search for truth. It's the idea that there's some world and I want to explore it, and then the question is how do I explore it? As an astronomer, as whatever. But so to me, there is continuity between being a science and a philosopher.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the current sharp distinction between science and philosophy is an artifact of academic specialization. Probably inevitable because both disciplines have become very specialized, very focused on narrow areas of expertise because that's the way you make progress these days. However, historically, science did begin as natural philosophy with the pre-Socratics all the way back, 2,600 years ago. And then, especially during the so-called scientific revolution that started in the 17th century, you can think of science as essentially going through a process of spinning out of branches of philosophy. So physics was the first one, Galileo and Newton. Chemistry came after that with Boyle. Biology came after with Darwin. Psychology with James. And now we're into the 20th century. So all of these disciplines were philosophy, were natural philosophy. And then as soon as they became more specialized and more independent, intellectually independent, and then they started, calling themselves something separate. But think about it this way: the term scientist was invented by William Whewell, who was one of the mentors of Darwin. So we're talking about 19th century. It's pretty late.
Yeah.
Before that, there was no scientist.
And it's interesting. At what point does science? Because I'm interested in the history of science, the philosophy of science, and so I always wonder, at what point did science veer toward materialism? I mean, it's interesting. I would guess the 19th century, that somehow there was this crisis.
Yeah, I think that was a gradual process.
Yeah.
Right. So Galileo was one of the first ones to say, look, if we want to make a progress in terms of understanding of the world, we need to set aside scriptures, not because scriptures are not true, but because they're not helpful in terms of understanding the world.
Right.
Math and experimentation is helpful. However, Galileo certainly was a believer, so was Newton. When Newton introduced...
Well, I would argue that Galileo was more a believer than the people who shut him down.
Very likely.
That he had a higher view of the scripture than the people who shut him down, who were basically Aristotelians. That's another story. But it is fascinating that you have these major scientific figures, Galileo and Newton at the top of the list, who were definitely more than what we think of as scientists today, even though they were some of the greatest scientists who ever lived.
Yes. Now, by the time you get to Darwin, Darwin starts out as a believer, as a Christian, and then he becomes agnostic.
Right.
Partly because of his work, partly because of personal tragedy, the death of his daughter. And then after that, we enter into the 20th century, and things become more and more materialists with the advent of new physics, quantum mechanics, general relativity, things like that. So the latest that I know in terms of data about this is that a preponderance of scientists are non-believers. They're either agnostics or atheists.
Right.
Which compared to the general population in the United States is an anomaly, because in the general population, the level of belief is about 90%. Among scientists is between 40 and 50%, depending on which sub-branch of science you actually are talking about. And if we're talking about the top scientists, the ones that are members of the National Academy, for instance, the percentage of believers goes down to 5%.
Interesting.
So it's definitely the case.
There seems to be a culture, as I say, and this is, listen, we find this all around the world and in every discipline, that, if you want to move forward, there's certain things you're public about or quiet about or whatever. But what I always find interesting is Einstein. I only know this because I wrote a book called Is Atheism Dead?, where I explore the Big Bang and whatever. And when Einstein, I'm sure you know this, but when his equations revealed to him in the 19 teens that the universe is expanding, he was kind of embarrassed by the implications of it. He knew that the scientific establishment already over 100 years ago would say, this is too religious, this looks like creationism or something like that. So he buries it with his cosmological constant, and then 15 years later has to admit, yes, I guess my equations were right. And so it's always fascinating to me to think that even over 100 years ago, the culture of the scientific world was such that you would be uncomfortable, I guess, by those kinds of implications toward something.
But that's understandable, right? I mean, science, at the basics, science is about evidence. And so scriptures, by definition, doesn't provide evidence. It's scripture, it's revelation. Right? So it's pretty reasonable for a scientist to be uncomfortable with anything that is not based in evidence of some kind.
Well, no, in this case, the evidence was there for Einstein, pointing him toward something that made him uncomfortable because of the ramifications of it. That was the idea that there's a moment of creation. I think he just said, I don't want to deal with this. And so he kind of...
But it's interesting you put it in terms of a moment of creation. I would say there was a moment of beginning. That's not necessarily the same.
No, that's right. But what I'm saying is that if you say moment of beginning, enough people would say, this sounds too much like creation, this makes us uncomfortable. It made Einstein uncomfortable. But I'm just fascinated by the culture of science, the culture of the idea of scientism. But I certainly didn't expect to be discussing this with you today. I expect to discuss Stoicism with you. But I'm fascinated because to me, there is or at least there ought to be a continuum when we're just talking about truth. I mean, that's it. And whether it's truth via science or via philosophy, I think it's all part of the same thing. And so how did you transition from philosophy of science into philosophy itself?
Well, in order to become a philosopher of science, I thought I better take things seriously. And that's why I went back and got a PhD in philosophy. And that means you have to take graduate level courses in, ethics, metaphysics, ancient philosophy, and so on and so forth. And that was fascinating. That was really pushing me in directions that I had not anticipated. But nevertheless, the goal initially was to become a philosopher of science, which is what I do. In my day job at City College, that's what I do. I specialize specifically in what is called the demarcation problem, which is the distinction or lack thereof between science and pseudoscience. That's my interest.
I'm very interested in this, if you don't mind, because you wrote a book about it called Nonsense on Stilts,
right.
How to Tell Science from Bunk. Can you say a little bit about this? Because this is something, I mean, we've always dealt with it, but it seems like we're dealing with it now, generally speaking. What is the demarcation line for you? How do you think about it?
I think the agreement among philosophers at this point, after literally more than a century of discussions, because the first one to talk about this issue was Karl Popper at the beginning of the 20th century. So we're talking about literally a century of discussions. And I think that it's fair to say that an agreement or a consensus among philosophers of science is that there is a distinction between science and pseudoscience, but it's not a sharp one. It's a continuum. So there are extreme cases that are pretty obvious: fundamental physics or chemistry. Those are sciences. Nobody in his right mind would sort of question that. At the opposite extreme, things like astrology, homeopathy, and things like that, those are definitely pseudosciences by any decent standard of evidence, reasoning, etc. But then there is the interesting stuff. There's stuff in between where at the moment you can't necessarily tell. You have to wait and see. For instance, up until recently, I would have put, recently meaning a few decades ago, I would have put parapsychology into the borderlines. For a long time, there were actual psychologists, academics who were doing research on things like telepathy and telekinesis and things like that. Now I think it's fairly settled. I think it's definitely sliding into the pseudoscience area. But I wouldn't be completely surprised if somebody actually published some new findings that sort of reversed the course. On the other side, there are things that people consider science, like the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, for instance. It's done by astronomers. It uses radio telescopes, which are some of the most expensive equipment, scientific equipment you can imagine. Nevertheless, the theory is pretty shaky. I mean, there is essentially no theory. It's just a hope that whoever is out there has a psychology similar to human beings, and so they want to communicate, and then they're going to use similar technology to what we have. That's hope. That's not a scientific theory. That's just a shot in the dark. Yes. And sure enough, we've been shooting in that dark since the 1950s, and we've got nothing so far.
Right.
Again, this could change tomorrow, right? We could wake up tomorrow morning, open the New York Times, and say, aliens found.
Right.
And at that point,
or something found, and then we have to figure out what it is that we found.
Right.
But yeah, no, that's it's interesting. I think, again, that's exploring what are the limits of science, or what is science. To me, I would say this is philosophy. This is to do real philosophy, to think about thinking.
That's right.
And to think about what does it mean to search for truth? Is there such a thing as truth? How can we know? What can we know? You know, that's what your average person is. We're living our lives trying to figure things out.
One way to understand what philosophers of science in particular do is to think about it this way. We have historians of science. Those are not scientists. Those are people who study science from the outside, from the development of science over time. We have sociologists of science. Again, they're not scientists. They're people who study science from the outside in terms of power structure, power relations, social interactions, and so on and so forth. And then you have philosophers of science who, again, are not scientists. They're people who look at science from the outside and look into the logical proceedings, the warrant that scientists have when they reach certain conclusions. Why do they agree on certain things and not others?
Right.
Why are they interested in certain things and not others? That's what a philosopher of science does.
If you think these conversations are valuable, would you do us a favor and please like this video and subscribe to this channel? When you do that, you help us get these conversations out to a wider audience by telling YouTube that people are interested in this. Also, you can go to SocratesInTheCity.com, sign up for our newsletter, and you can check back every week. There's new stuff here every week. Thank you for tuning in.